With that, I'd like to invite Ambassador Shyam Saran and Richard Haass for the first conversation. Ambassador Saran, you've been a great friend to Gateway House. We welcome you back. Richard, we welcome you to Bombay. As I don't know how many of you know, but Manjeet, who is one of the co-founders of Gateway House, was a fellow at Council on Foreign Relations. And this idea of starting Gateway House was conceived while she was at Council on Foreign Relations with our other co-founder, Neelam Dev. And so we are a membership-based model, just like Council on Foreign Relations, and based in Bombay, a financial center. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Richard. And with that, I will let Ambassador Saran take it from here.
Thank you very much. And let me begin by expressing my thanks to Gateway House, to my very dear colleague, Ambassador Neelam Deo and Manjeet, for inviting me to this event, very, very prestigious event that Gateway House is hosting, and giving me an opportunity to share the platform with an old friend, but also someone whom I admire greatly as one of our leading scholars on international relations. This will be a conversation between Richard and myself, and I have told Richard that please feel free to ask me questions. It should not be only you who should be on the firing line. This is more of a conversation rather than my asking Richard questions. So let me begin at least by setting the stage for this conversation on India-US relations in a changing landscape in Asia. Let me begin by pointing to the fact that Richard, of course, has written this great book, A World in Disarray, which I think encapsulates the kind of situation that we are facing. But let me recall that Chairman Mao used to say, there is great disorder under heaven, but the situation is excellent. So while we have a world in disarray, at least some people would seem to think that actually this is also a period of great opportunity. And in Asia, particularly we see, since there has been, as people say, a shift in the center of gravity of the global economy from the transatlantic to the trans-Pacific, that there is a cluster of major powers who are emerging in Asia, led by China itself. We have now China, which is under Emperor Xi, no longer just Chairman Xi. So we have a very, very complex situation here in Asia. And, this is one of the areas where there appears to be a growing convergence between the United States and India in terms of ensuring some kind of a balance in this very complex landscape. So with the kind of administration that we have in the United States today, of which you have written a great deal, how do you see India and the United States being able to, in a sense, try and shape the emerging architecture in our region? Richard.
Well, thank you, Shyam, and thank you all for being here. And when Manjeet and I talked about this idea of Gateway House, even the most ambitious plans did not envision something quite like this. So she and her colleagues are to be applauded. This is extraordinary what you've built here. People used to ask me, why don't you create branches of the Council on Foreign Relations around the world? And I said, what would be so much better is if you had local homegrown organizations. This is what civil society is all about. And it would be an Indian organization staffed and with members from India that would address the world from that point of view. And that's exactly what's been done here. So it's really a model of what we need to see all over the world. So again, congratulations. This is impressive. One of the many reasons I am not a Maoist is I don't exactly find the idea that when everything is chaotic, the situation is excellent. That's only true if you believe the status quo works against you. And it's only true if you believe you have something better to put in its place. And when I look at the arc of history over the last 3/4 of a century, since the end of World War II, I see actually much to preserve rather than to destroy. And to me, the challenge in foreign policy is not to stand still, but it's to preserve what is good and then to add on to it, to innovate and modify to deal with new sets of realities, be they challenges or entities with capacity or what have you. So that is where I would come at it. And I would simply say, as you would expect from somebody who's written a book with as pessimistic a title as I have, I do think this is a particularly challenging moment in international relations. We have more capacity and more hands than in any other time in human history. Many of the arrangements which have helped organize the world, which were created after World War II, are clearly inadequate. Either they don't have the right participants, something like the UN Security Council, or among other things, countries like India, as well as Japan, are not represented, or we simply don't really have the arrangements, say, to deal with new issues such as cyberspace. What are to be the rules and regulations of this new domain, this new technology? And what I think we've learned is that the world doesn't organize itself. For all of us who went through high school or college science, the natural way of things is what people would call entropy. It's centrifugal forces. It's movements away from order rather than naturally coalescing. And what we've seen through, again, the last 70 years is order was something that had to be introduced and worked at. The Cold War didn't end peacefully in the way it did simply because it was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It worked because of the hard work of the Atlantic countries, as well as some of the internal flaws of the Soviet Union. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait a quarter of a century ago, which was the first challenge of the post-Cold War period, it didn't just happen that he failed, but the United States, working with many of the leading countries in the world, worked politically, economically, and ultimately militarily to reject what he had done. And what we also see is when the world doesn't act, bad things happen. Look at what's going on as we sit here today. Look at what's going on in Syria. This is a tragedy, and it's an outrage by any and every measure, but the world isn't acting. Or what is going on in Yemen, or what happened when the world simply tolerated the Soviet takeover of Crimea and its continuing instability, what it's fomenting in eastern Ukraine, or when China acts in the South China Sea. The world, again, doesn't simply organize itself to deal with challenges. And that's where I think the Foreign Secretary's question comes in, Shyam's question comes in, which is what can the United States and India do about it? And the mere fact that you can ask that question is to me a sign of progress. Because for much of my career, and I expect for your career, a realistic question would have been, how can the United States and India avoid getting in each other's way? How can we avoid annoying one another? And I think often during the Cold War, that was the natural way. And I think with the end of the Cold War, it opened up this tremendous opportunity for these two countries to begin to develop what I would call habits of strategic cooperation. And that's what we want. Ideally, when I worked at the White House and there was a crisis, what would always happen is the staff people like me would go in and suggest that the president get on the phone. And he would get on the phone to a foreign leader to speak about how we can maybe coordinate our behavior. How do you see this? What could we maybe do together? And one of my goals is that the Prime Minister of India would be near the top of the list for an American president to call if and when there were crises out in Asia. And I think we're moving in that direction. And what it takes are countries that are like-minded and willing and able to do some things together. And I think one of the biggest questions in this part of the world is going to be China. And the question is, China's obviously rising. You talked about what's going on domestically. It's concentrating and consolidating political power at home. And again, the real question is, how will China's rise play out? There's a whole literature about China's peaceful rise. And it's obviously in India and America's interest to see that it's in fact peaceful. It's not coercive. It does not take unilateral action such as it's taking in the South China Sea to create facts, that China essentially becomes fully integrated in the region and the world on terms that are widely and broadly accepted. So I guess my question for you, sir, for Shyam, is psychologically and politically now, two questions. What is the consensus here about China? And to what extent now do Indian politics allow India to work with countries like the United States? We're not talking about alliances, but to coordinate with the United States selectively, if need be, not so much against China, but rather in favor of Indo-Pacific, if one wants to use that phrase, where China, all the incentive is for China to act with restraint rather than to act in any other way.
Thank you, Richard. I avoided talking about, the consequences of China's rise because I think there is a kind of a narrative of the inevitability of Chinese domination or preeminence in Asia, which I do not accept. So if you're asking what is the consensus in India, I'm not in government, but certainly as an Indian, I would say that it is unlikely that India would accept a hegemonic order in Asia. It's as simple as that. And I also believe that if there is one country in this region which has the wherewithal in terms of its size, its population, its economy, the capabilities that its population has in cutting-edge technologies, it is only India. Now, having said that, will India sort of step up to the plate is I think there is a legitimate question being asked. Does India's politics allow India, in fact, to play that role? I would say that there has always been this issue of, the glass half full or glass half empty as far as India is concerned. But I think if you look at the trajectory of India over the last, 2 decades, I think that trajectory would seem to indicate that while there may be perhaps not a straight line rise of India, it will probably, as a messy democracy, as United States itself is, it will probably zigzag. But I think as long as the direction is right, then I do believe that it is the future of Asia will not be a future that is dominated by China, despite the very, very impressive capabilities that it has accumulated. But Asia will be home to a cluster of major powers, in which US presence will certainly be a very important component. But to think of Asia as somehow having only one power is simply not the reality. That is not the ground reality. And I would also say that you yourself in your book have pointed out that the new world order that we are talking about would require states not only to assert their rights as Westphalian states, but also having obligations. Because we are living in a world where there are so many cross-cutting issues. Most of the challenges that we face have a global dimension. It is only collaborative global responses that can enable us to deal with issues like, say, climate change or non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or public health issues. So if the logic of today's world, which is a highly globalized world, is that only collaborative responses can lead us to some kind of order from this disarray that we are talking about, then in that context also, we cannot think in terms anymore of a hegemonic order.
I agree 100%. I also think that when people talk about China, they also have to appreciate some of the internal or domestic challenges to China. One of the things we know about history, it is rarely, if ever, linear. And China faces all sorts of domestic hurdles that could affect its ability to play a certain kind of role beyond its borders. And I also don't necessarily assume that its plans are fully formed. In my experience, countries have inclinations, but then depending upon what the response is to certain probes, what happens, those inclinations can be shaped. Indeed, one way to think about your own foreign policy, the purpose of it is to shape the foreign policy of others, to encourage certain behaviors and discourage others. And that's what I would say in large part we should be doing vis-a-vis China. It's one of the reasons that I hope one day, sooner rather than later, the United States can find its way back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not just for the economic reasons, but for the strategic benefits of doing so. And I also think, coming back to something you mentioned, Shyam, about U.S.-Indian relations, I agree. We need a broader agenda. There really ought not to be any global issue that India and the United States don't speak on, because maybe we can fashion some sort of a common approach, whether it's dealing with cyber or what ought to be the rules there, or dealing with climate, obviously, because Paris, even if one were fully supportive of it, is not adequate. And the real question is what's going to come after, and what's going to come after that. And then there's obviously the full range of trade issues. We're probably living in a moment, in part because of the United States, where many aspects of the global trading order are going to be challenged. And I disagree with some of the things that have been recently said or decided in Washington. But one of the things that countries like the United States and India are going to have to decide is, for example, national security, broadly or loosely defined, a legitimate basis for acting in the area of walling off your country from certain imports. And if that were to be the case, what are the limits on it, and how do you avoid it being abused as simply a means towards selective protection? Because everybody has national security, everybody has concerns, and how do we deal with that? We're also seeing in the United States, it's the big news of this morning, a fundamental debate about foreign investment, takeovers of companies, and so forth, and what ought to be the strategic guidelines that ought to influence or shape what foreign entities are allowed to take over what domestic entities. And just as we talk about protectionism in the world of trade, I think we have to have a conversation about what are the rules, principles, procedures for managing what could otherwise become investment protectionism. And ought all these decisions to simply be unilateral? Ought there to be some court of appeals? What ought to be the international guidelines? Do we need some kind of an international mechanism to, and as we have in trade, as we have in other economic domains, for countries who feel that their rights have been abridged in terms of investment to take it to? So I think we're at a moment where, again, the agenda for U.S.-India relations is it's both the old traditional agenda you and I worked on so much, the old political military agenda, regionally and globally, but obviously now it's suddenly, or not so suddenly, so much more.
Well, what worries me about India-US relations is really a kind of inherent imbalance which is there in the relationship. There is no doubt that there are very strong security convergences between the two countries. United States and India perhaps have many more military exercises with one another than perhaps the US does with any other country. It would be fair to say that despite the uncertainties which have been introduced because of political developments in the United States, that the defense cooperation between the two countries, very importantly, counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries has really expanded and has not been impacted by the kind of political changes that have taken place in the United States. So that's the good news. But the not so good news is that the other pillar, I imagine, which is one of the most important pillars of any bilateral relationship, which is the economic pillar, that in the India-US context is a very weak pillar. And I think there are times when I see that the relationship becomes almost adversarial in dealing with trade issues and economic issues. And I believe that the two countries have simply not found their way to have a really serious conversation about how to really take their economic relationship forward. Because just as there is strategic convergence between the two countries on security issues, I believe there is really no reason why India, US should not have a really very strong economic partnership as well. I mean, for India, going forward, in a sense, the US is an indispensable partner. If you look at this from the US perspective, if you are looking at what is a country with which the US can really have a very positive long-term relationship, in terms of, say, technology partnership, in terms of, the market that India offers, investment opportunities that India offers. There are very few countries which can match India. But somehow or the other, despite a theoretical sort of listing of these advantages, we have simply not been able to get to where we want to be. So this is one of the vulnerabilities, I think, in the relationship which needs urgent repair, I believe. Secondly, I would also like to ask you, Richard, when we are talking about how India and US can work together to shape what is inevitably going to be a very different order from what we have talked about earlier. Someone whom you admire very much, and I do too, which is Henry Kissinger. He has said that when you are trying to work out a strategy, you need to decide what is so important to me that I will defend it even if nobody else is willing to stand with me. So what is really vital to my interests? Second, there may be second order interests where I would, in fact, try to defend as long as there are other allies and other partners who are willing to stand together with us in pursuing those. And there are others where we don't really have much of a stake. So in that context, if you're looking at this world in disarray, what would you say are really some of those vital interests of the United States, where the US is really willing to stand alone? You have mentioned, for example, in other writings about the Korean Peninsula as being a very key challenge for the United States of America. I don't know whether the rise of China is seen by you in a similar context. But what is it that is today, in the US perspective, something really vital to its interests, and what are other areas where partnerships between India and the US can really play an important role in advancing our interests?
Well, it's the big question, and it's slightly harder than usual to answer it. It's good you're all sitting down, simply because of the character, the substance and process associated with American foreign policy at this moment in time. But one way of thinking of the answer, the Korean Peninsula, this administration has repeatedly said it would not accept a North Korea that has nuclear weapons with long-range missiles that could reach the United States. North Korea is either at such a point or soon will be. We now have the prospect of some diplomacy. So the question is, will diplomacy succeed? If not, what is the alternative? Is it further coercion through sanctions? Is it the use of military force? Might the United States decide that as much as it doesn't like a North Korea with those kinds of capabilities, it can nonetheless live with them through deterrence and defense? I don't know the answer to it, but I think that set of issues is clearly at the top of the American national security agenda. I think in the Middle East, there's a growing consensus that Iran poses a serious threat. For some, it's through the nuclear agreement. I don't think that. The nuclear agreement, for all of its shortcomings, at least stabilizes the near-term situation, but I think there is a view that Iran is anything but a status quo country in the Middle East and is pushing to assert and expand its influence, and the question is, how do we respond to that? I think there's issues with Russia. If Russia were to move against a NATO country, as it has, say, again, as it's moving against eastern Ukraine, much less against Crimea, that would obviously involve the vital national interests of the United States. Some would say what Russia's done to us directly, interfering in the American political process, interfering in the political processes of other democracies. That crosses a line. and we ought to respond in all sorts of ways there. There's obviously, rumor has it, something of a debate going on in my country about that, just that. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I think on the short list these days is what is going on in Venezuela, which has now become in some ways the greatest refugee crisis in the world. And for us, this isn't half a world away, but it's quite close, and it's clearly beginning to overwhelm the capacity of the neighboring states. It's a reminder that what you think of as a national challenge or crisis can very quickly become a regional or international crisis. And then there's also, a whole set of global issues. And the president, if he were here, he would probably say fixing the global trade order, which he sees as imbalanced against the interest of the United States. I would obviously take issue with that. But I think that issue is rising to the fore, and whether it's going to be in bilateral ways with China or systemic ways with the WTO. I think we're quite possibly meeting here on what could be the edge of a major global debate or even crisis about one important aspect of order that essentially is 70 or so years old. So what you have, I say, in the United States more broadly is a fairly daunting inbox or agenda. I think I've just mentioned a few things. You could add to it. And what's so interesting to me is you have all these things that have come at us, and there's not a clear consensus in the United States about what to do about them. And that's what makes it, to me, a particularly worrisome time in history. That this contrast between, how would I put it, a world in disarray, to use my term, and something of a country, if not in disarray, at least not of one mind about what needs to be done.
Yeah. So, you have mentioned in your opening remarks that whatever was a rule-based order which was put in place under US leadership after the Second World War, that inevitably has to adjust to changing situations. But there are many important components which are of value and need to be maintained. I would submit that today the greatest threat to that order comes from the United States itself. Because if we are looking at a rule-based international trading order, you have this strange situation where the US expresses great dissatisfaction, takes action which may be undermining it, and you have the Chinese raising their hand and saying, we are for this order, for a globalized trading system. So I think part of the challenge for countries like India, which I think wish to see United States succeed, because a successful United States, a vibrant democratic United States, a plural democracy like United States is actually an invaluable asset for plural democracies like India. So I think part of the problem is going forward when we are looking at the changing world order and really thinking in terms of how we can retain some of the components of value to us, and also cooperate together to make the adjustments which are necessary. We are faced with a situation where the most important defender of that order is itself, to my mind, to be bluntly honest, seems to be the greatest threat to that order.
See, this is a conversation I so looked forward to. Look, this puts people like me in a remarkably difficult and awkward position. For 70 years, you're right, the United States was the principal designer and upholder of a set of arrangements and rules around the world, which I believe history will judge to have been quite wise and quite generous in many ways. And Mr. Trump is the first president who has assumed the office who doesn't believe that. That in many ways he believes that the costs of maintaining this order have outweighed the benefits that have accrued to the United States, and whether in the trading realm or more broadly, say, with alliances and other arrangements. I disagree with his calculations, but he is in fact the president. And when I wrote the afterword to this book, The World in Disarray, and in the paperback version, I said that we were seeing something that was in many ways without historical precedent. Usually great powers, who are the principal organizers and upholders of orders, continue doing them until one of two things happen. Either they exhaust themselves, say what happened to Britain, or they essentially can't sustain it and lose, which is what happened to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. The United States had created something of a precedent, a third mechanism, which I labeled abdication, but it had simply decided that it was no longer a worthwhile or an undertaking where the benefits justified the costs. So you do have a United States that is selectively, not universally, but selectively walking away from many of its commitments. I disagree with that. I think it's unfortunate for the world. I think it's unfortunate for the United States, because I do think the world will be a messier place as a result, and given the nature of this world, we will be affected by that. We can't insulate ourselves no matter how many walls we build and how high those walls might be. So one of the questions then, and it affects countries like India, is to what extent will other countries recognizing this say to themselves, we have been on balance a beneficiary of this American-led order. Clearly the United States, at least for a time, maybe longer, but at least for a time, is having doubts or second thoughts. Are we prepared to step up to some extent, not to fill America's shoes, but to play a larger role? And I think that's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question for India. It's a legitimate question for America's friends and allies in Europe, because we know that a number of countries will see this as an opportunity not to enhance order, but to promote agendas that are clearly a threat to the order. North Korea is one, I would say Iran is one, Russia is a third, Turkey in many ways is a fourth. So I do think it's an open question to the world, is you can simply wait until the United States hopefully reappears in a familiar guise. We don't know how long that might be and how familiar the guise would be, and by which point the world predictably will have deteriorated. Or other countries can say, okay, this is not something we wish for, this is not something we predicted, but here we are, and we have to assume a larger set of responsibilities and burdens as a favor to ourselves. And I think that's now, in some ways, the big national security question facing the countries of Europe, facing India, facing Australia, Japan, South Korea, and some other what I would call like-minded countries. What you basically would say, the countries that had been pillars or beneficiaries of what we call the liberal world order. If they want a liberal world order to largely continue into the future, my sense is they have to be prepared to step up and play a larger role.
That is, I would say, almost self-evident. But you yourself have said, Richard, that if there is no US-led world order, it is in fact going to be a nobody-led world.
Can I say for the record that it's truly unfair to be having a public conversation with someone who's read what I've written? It puts me at a tremendous disadvantage. So I just want to state that for the record.
I did this so that we can begin to shape the new world order. So if it is, and I do not believe, in fact, that if it is not going to be a US-led world order, it is going to be, in fact, some kind of a vacuum. It will not be. Because inherently there will be something which will take its place. We may not like what takes its place, but I believe that something will take its place. What I would not like to see taking place, coming back to what I said earlier, is that place should be taken by a China. I mean, that's something which is quite clear, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, going through Asia, when we are talking to our friends in Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia, no one, in fact, wishes to see precisely that China, dominated order in Asia. I think the challenge is how then do you construct a new balance in the region, a new equilibrium in the region, which will enable you. It is not so much a matter of not welcoming China's rise, because I think China's rise is also an opportunity, has proved to be an opportunity for countries. But how do you prevent a unilateral assertion of power by a rising China? I mean, that's really the challenge. And the crystallization of some kind of a countervailing coalition, which is what I believe this would have to be, also needs to be backed by power. You cannot have balance without power. So I think there is a certain diffidence amongst the countries who could play that role, not to be seen somehow or the other involved in containing China. Because there is always this complaint from China, oh, you are setting up another Asian NATO. But I think it is inevitable that if you wish to prevent that from emerging, you have no option but, in fact, to have that kind of countervailing coalition. What role can the US play in that respect?
Look, let me say a few things, because as you say, I have written that the alternative to a US-led world is a nobody-led world. And that essentially, I believe, is where we're potentially moving, and to some extent we've already arrived, and as we've seen in the Middle East, it's not pretty. The world does not get up in the morning and organize itself. I don't think that China has either the capability or in some ways the strategic mentality to do that either. I think China has its hands full at home, and I think there's certain limits to its reach and appeal. But I take your point that the policy towards China needs to be one of multiple personalities. On one hand, China ought to be welcomed into regional and global arrangements, but so long as the terms are fair and reasonable for others and not simply for China, not simply preferential for China, and where China is seen as encroaching on arrangements that are fair and reasonable for others, those others ought to push back. So my guess is we're looking at a period of a relationship with China that has more than one personality. It has elements of an integration of bringing them in, but also elements of pushing back when China threatens to act in ways unilaterally that are inconsistent with the arrangements or principles that others want. So one thing that's a positive step is the establishment of the TPP by the 11th. And I would like to see that ultimately deepen and broaden. And ultimately, the incentive ought to be for China to enter, but on terms that force China to deal with behaviors in the economic realm that we find objectionable, whether it's forced transfers of intellectual property theft, certain types of subsidies, obviously traditional concerns like dumping and so forth, that China ought not to be given a free pass, but saying if you want to have the kind of access you want to have to these markets, these have to be the terms. We want to have a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. No one ought to recognize what China is doing unilaterally in the South China Sea. China simply should not be able to create facts the way it is and have anyone accept them. And we also, ought to continue to challenge what China is doing with naval vessels and overflights. We ought to make clear that just because China puts down sand in the ocean and makes certain claims and draws certain maps, that doesn't make it so. And the United States and others have to continue to demonstrate that China has not created a new legal or actual status quo. I believe that our own naval and military cooperation in the Indian and Pacific Oceans needs to increase. And I think we have a number of like-minded states. India, I think the United States is more than willing to do this. Australia, Japan will be playing a larger role. South Korea, conceivably, Vietnam, and so forth. I think there is a constellation, and we're going to have to think about regional arrangements that are less than alliances, but do represent degrees of partnerships or alignments. And I think that's where we are. Intelligence sharing is another thing. Diplomatic coordination is another thing. So we're not talking about a NATO for Asia. I don't think the history, the geography lends itself to that. But the idea that there would be greater coordination and greater effort among like-minded countries, I think is exactly the model that we ought to be pursuing. And I think the United States and India are two of the central entities or actors in that. And I would say more broadly, in other domains of international relations, we have to see where the United States is. In climate, for example, you just had the visit here of the French president, Monsieur Macron. And that's obviously an area where, among others, the Europeans are going to take the lead. And India and China, for that matter, have a role. And I think in the United States, there's a lot of people who support that. A lot of them are governors, a lot of them are mayors, a lot of those are corporate leaders. And you're going to have to find ways of working with the United States through other windows than simply the federal government in Washington. And climate is a good example of that. In the technology realm and cyberspace, working with companies is going to be an important dimension of the foreign policy, rather than, again, simply through the window of the federal government. Congress has all sorts of potential. If right now, for example, one of the interesting tests will be Congress, which years ago granted the authority to the executive branch to introduce sanctions, as the president has said he would do the other day. Congress, when it grants authority, can also take it away. So one of the issues I would say for foreign governments is how to interact with Congress, to encourage it, to see the risk to American potential well-being in the economic realm or strategic realm, for that matter, if these sanctions were to continue, what might be the retaliation and why more Americans might be worse off rather than better off. So I think there's many avenues to interact with and even try to influence the United States, rather than simply putting all your eggs in the basket of an administration that admittedly has a very different view in many areas of America's role in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I think we have covered a lot of ground during the last 40 minutes. Let me say that the takeaway for me is that we are living in a world maybe in disarray, but I think we are inevitably getting into circles of cooperation with like-minded countries. There are coalitions of interests rather than alliances that are actually going to be the feature of the new world order. Much looser, perhaps, but also in a sense much more flexible, much more capable of being molded to the new challenges that we are going to be facing. And we do hope that the India-US relationship will be a very important element of finding solutions to the kind of challenges that we face. So thank you very much, Richard. This has been a great honor for me to have this opportunity to exchange views with you. I hope the audience here, very distinguished audience here, has also enjoyed this conversation. And now I would open the floor to some questions. I think you will give us some questions that we should take up in the next few minutes.
Hello. This question is for Richard Haass. The US is putting brakes on the WTO dispute resolution mechanism and now the protectionism. Do you think this is the end of free trade and capitalism as we know it?
I don't think it's the end of free trade. I don't think it's the end of capitalism. It's not yet clear what the policy actually will be coming out of Washington. I think we'll have a better sense of what the policy will be in coming days and weeks. I would just say that there are large voices in both parties. This is not just Donald Trump. This is, let me take a step back. During the recent 2016 presidential election, one of the very few issues that Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, all agreed on was they opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Votes over the last 10 or 20 years on giving the president the trade negotiating authority, what's called Trade Promotion Authority that he required to negotiate free trade agreements was the votes were getting more and more difficult. A majority of Democrats and a narrowing base of Republicans would support it. So I think the reality is that there's been a secular shift in the United States away from support for free trade. I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's based upon a wrong interpretation. People see jobs disappearing and connect that to free trade rather than seeing the jobs disappearing and connecting it for the most part to innovation, productivity increases, and the like. But the politics are what the politics are. So I think, no, I don't think it's the end of the day, but I think we need to figure out how to have a debate in the United States where people see not just the alleged costs of free trade, but the very real costs of the so-called remedies that are being put forward, and that we need to have a fuller conversation about things that need doing. I'm going to sort of make a point. I actually think one of the biggest issues facing my country, but not just the United States, facing countries around the world, wealthy and poor alike, is going to be the introduction of new technologies, autonomous vehicles, robotics, artificial intelligence, you name it. These will be both at one and the same time. They will destroy jobs and they will create jobs. The problem is going to be that the jobs that they create will have requirements for skills on the part of workers which will be fundamentally different and more demanding than the jobs that they're going to destroy. So one big debate for a society is how do we get our workforce from where it is to where it needs to be? How do we close this totally predictable gap? The second is on the notion that this is not a one-time thing, but this is going to be recurring. How do we structure a career, a life? So an individual who's going to have maybe 10 jobs, how does he or she navigate this process? What happens to healthcare? What happens to insurance? What happens to retirement and so forth? In the United States, most benefits are linked to your job. Well, what happens when your job is part-time or doesn't pay benefits or you have to keep changing jobs? We need to have massive conversations in the United States to essentially prepare our society. In the absence of that, trade, like immigration, tends to get scapegoated. People are looking for easy answers and excuses and targets. And unfortunately, if we go after trade or we go after immigration, on balance, we will hurt ourselves in many ways, economically and otherwise. So this is a debate that needs to be joined. And there's no consensus. The administration has one point of view, but I would simply say amongst experts and people who I believe know the facts, that's a minority point of view. The question is how this debate can be conducted in the public space in a way that we will come out differently. And that's actually a challenge to a lot of us in this room.
We have maybe one more question.
This one's for Shyam Saran. Can India act to prevent a hegemonic Asia on its own?
I doubt it, but as I said, that it is not an either-or kind of a situation. I believe that Asia is already, in fact, a multipolar order because it is home to, as I said, a cluster of major powers. So not only is China rising, but we have simultaneously an India which is rising. You have established powers like Japan, which today would count as not only a major economic power, but fast becoming a very, very substantial military power as well. You have countries in Southeast Asia. A very underrated country, for example, is Indonesia. Probably in the next decade or so, probably going to emerge as a very, very important country in the region. A fundamental element in any kind of maritime balance in the region, for example. So I do believe that the building blocks of some kind of a multipolar order in Asia are already in place. But I also believe that because India, for the reasons that I mentioned, as a continental size economy and a very, very large country with significant economic and military capabilities, is going to be a very leading element in any kind of a coalition that we are thinking of in the region. And again, I would repeat, the idea is not that this should exclude China. But how do we create a balance in the region which prevents the unilateral assertion of power by a China which believes that it has the capability as well as the opportunity to change the facts on the ground. That is what we need to resist. Okay, I think we have come to the end of the session. Richard, thank you very much. That has been a very, very stimulating conversation indeed. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you to Gateway.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Saran and Richard.